The kerosene lamp flickered on the heavy oak table. Its rhythmic pulsing the only heartbeat in a room turned to stone. The light cast long, jagged shadows against the hand-hewn log walls of the cabin, making the trophies of Silas's solitary life, the antlers, the dried herbs, the iron cookware, look like specters watching a funeral. Outside, the Montana wind didn't just howl. It screamed, a high, lonely sound that rattled the window panes in their frames and carried the scent of the coming snow. Clara sat with her spine rigid, a posture drilled into her by years of finishing schools and the crushing weight of family expectations. Her traveling suit, a deep navy wool that had been the height of Boston fashion 2 months ago, was now a map of her journey, stained with the soot of the locomotive, the red dust of the stagecoach, and the salt of tears shed in the dark. It pinched at her waist, a physical reminder of how poorly she fit into this rugged landscape. Across from her sat Silas. He was a man built of granite and secrets, his shoulders so broad they seemed to soak up the dim light of the room. His face was a landscape of its own, hard lines etched by sun and wind, eyes the color of a frozen lake. He hadn't looked at her once since she had stepped off the stagecoach 3 hours ago. He hadn't even offered to take her trunk. He had simply shouldered it like a burden he was forced to carry and walk toward the cabin. "I understand," Clara said. Her voice was brittle, like thin ice over a deep pond, but it didn't break. "The letters my sister wrote, she meant well. Martha has always been the storyteller of the family. She saw your advertisement and she saw my desperation, and she wove them together into a lie she thought would save us both." Silas finally moved, but only to reach for a tin cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. His hands were massive, the knuckles scarred and the palms calloused to the texture of bark. They were hands meant for breaking earth and taming beasts, not for holding the delicate, lace-trimmed fingers of a woman who knew more about sonnets than soil. "She wrote that you grew up on a farm in Ohio," Silas rasped. His voice was deep, unused to the friction of conversation. "She wrote that you could slaughter a hog, bake 10 loaves of bread before noon, and that you weren't afraid of a little mud on your skirts." "I have never seen a hog slaughtered in my life," Clara confessed, the honesty feeling like a sharp blade in her throat. "And the only bread I've ever made was under the supervision of a cook who grew frustrated when I couldn't get the measurements right." Martha painted a picture of a woman. "I am not because she knew you wouldn't look at the woman I am. You wanted a farmhand's soul in a lady's body. I am just the lady." Silas set the cup down with a deliberate thud. He looked up then, and the intensity of his gaze made Clara want to shrink back into the shadows. It wasn't anger. She saw there. It was a weary kind of disappointment that hurt far worse. "This land eats ladies, Clara," he said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. "The Winters here don't care about your pedigree or the fine cut of your coat. They don't care if you can play the piano or speak French. They care if you can keep the fire going when the wood is wet and the drifts are 6 feet high. They care if you can keep your head when the wolves are at the door. It's a hard life for a soft heart. I won't have your misery or your death on my conscience." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara looked around the small, functional space. It was a home built for survival, not for comfort. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor to dampen the sound of her own heartbeat. She was a decorative bird trapped in a hawk's nest, and they both knew it. She felt the sting of rejection, a hot, prickly sensation behind her eyes, but she refused to let a single tear fall. She had spent her last cent on the ticket to Montana. She had sold her mother's locket and her father's books to escape a life of genteel poverty and the looming shadow of a marriage to a man 3 times her age who smelled of stale tobacco and avarice. She had come here for a new start, for a man who seemed, through his brief and honest letters, to be a man of integrity. But Silas hadn't written those letters. He had hired the local schoolmaster to write them for him. 2 strangers had been brought together by 2 different sets of lies, and now they were crashing against the reality of a cold Montana night. "Then we are settled," Clara said, standing up. Her legs were shaky, but she kept her chin high. She smoothed the front of her dusty navy suit, trying to reclaim some shred of the dignity she had felt when she first boarded the train. "I've overstayed a welcome I never truly had. I see now that my presence here is an imposition, a mistake that cannot be unmade by staying." Silas didn't move to stop her. He stayed seated, staring at the embers in the hearth. I'll leave at dawn, she continued, the words catching in her throat like a burr. I noticed a small hotel, or at least a boarding house, back in the township, near the stage stop. I'll find work there. I can sew, or perhaps I can tutor the children. I'll stay until I can afford the fare back, east. I won't be a burden to you a moment longer than the sun takes to rise. She turned toward the small guest loft, a narrow set of stairs built into the corner of the cabin. Each step felt like a mile. She reached the top and looked down one last time. Silas was a silhouette against the dying fire, a man as solitary and unyielding as the mountains outside. "Good night, Mr. Vance," she whispered. He didn't answer. He simply picked up a poker and jabbed at the logs, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney to be lost in the dark. Clara retreated into the loft, pulling the thin wool blanket up to her chin, listening to the wind and the silence, realizing that the cold front wasn't just outside. It had moved into the very center of her life. Blanket the world was a bruised purple when Clara woke. The loft was frigid, the air so sharp it stung the inside of her nose with every breath. She didn't need a clock to know it was nearly dawn. The silence of the wilderness had a different quality just before the sun broke. Heavy, expectant hush that felt like a weight against the eardrums. She dressed with numb fingers, layering her thinnest chemise under her navy suit and wrapping a knitted shawl around her shoulders. She moved with the stealth of a thief, avoiding the floorboards. She had learned creaked during her restless night of tossing and turning. Her valise sat by the ladder, packed with the meager remains of her former life. A silver-backed hairbrush, a book of Keats, and 3 changes of undergarments. It felt lighter than it had yesterday, as if the disappointment of the previous night had evaporated some of its mass. She descended the ladder one rung at a time, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the main room, the hearth was nothing but gray ash and a few stubborn, glowing embers. The smell of cold ash and old coffee hung thick in the air. Clara made her way toward the heavy front door. She could see the faint outline of the frame, the jagged silhouette of the iron hinges. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered near the latch. She wanted to be gone before Silas woke. She didn't think she could endure another look of weary pity or another reminder of her own inadequacy. She wanted to step out into the frost, walk until her lungs burned, and disappear into the white expanse of the Montana morning. But when her fingers brushed the wood, they met an obstruction. A thick square beam of seasoned pine sat firmly in the iron brackets. Spanning the width of the door, it was the bar, a primitive but unbreakable lock used to keep out the wind, the wolves, and the desperate. Clara frowned, her brow furrowing in the gloom. She gripped the timber, bracing her feet to lift it. It didn't budge. It was heavy, weighted by more than just gravity. She tried again, a soft grunt of exertion escaping her throat, but the wood felt as though it had grown into the very walls of the cabin. "It's notched," a low, gravelly voice said from the darkness of the corner. Clara jumped, a small cry escaping her lips as she spun around. Silas was there, sitting in the same chair he had occupied the night before. He hadn't been asleep. He was a shadow among shadows, his large frame cloaked in a heavy, shearling coat that smelled of lanolin and cedar. He held a rifle across his knees, the steel barrel gleaming faintly in the dying light of the embers. "You scared me," Clara gasped, clutching her shawl to her chest. "I told you I was leaving at dawn. It's light enough to see the trail." "Is it?" Silas stood, his height dominating the small room. He moved toward the window and wiped a circle into the frost on the pane. "Look out there, Clara." She stepped forward, squinting through the glass. The world wasn't purple anymore. It was white. A thick swirling curtain of snow was falling, so dense that the barn, located only 30 yards away, was a mere ghost of a shape in the gale. The wind wasn't howling now. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that shook the very foundations of the house. "The stage doesn't run in a whiteout," Silas said, "and the trail to town is gone. 5 minutes out there and you'd lose your bearings. 10 minutes and the sleepiness would set in. You wouldn't make it to the creek, let alone the township." "I have to go," Clara insisted, her voice rising with a touch of panic. "You don't want me here. You said it yourself, this land eats ladies. I won't stay where I'm a burden. I won't wait for you to look at me every morning and wish I were someone else." She turned back to the door, her hands grappling fruitlessly with the pine bar. "Move aside, Silas. You made your choice yesterday. You rejected the arrangement. You rejected me. Don't make me a prisoner today." Silas didn't move toward the door to help her, nor did he retreat. He stepped into the center of the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He set the rifle down on the table and walked toward her until he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his coat. "I'm not keeping you prisoner," Silas said. His hand reached out not to move the bar, but to rest on the wood just above her head, effectively pinning her between the door and his massive frame. His eyes, which had been so cold and distant the night before, were now burning with a fierce, protective light that made her breath hitch. "I told you I was leaving at dawn," Clara whispered, her defiance wavering under the intensity of his stare. "And I'm telling you that you aren't going anywhere," Silas replied, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Not alone." Clara blinked, her head tilting back to look at him. "What?" "I sat here all night, Clara, watching the fire go out, thinking about what I said to you." He exhaled a long, shaky breath that smelled of the winter air. "I'm a fool. I've lived out here so long, I've forgotten that there's more than one kind of strength. I saw the lace on your cuffs and the way you hold your teacup, and I thought you were weak. I thought you were something fragile that would break the moment the mercury dropped." He stepped a fraction closer, his shadow engulfing her. "Then I watched you sit through that talk last night. I watched you face the fact that your life was a lie and your future was gone, and you didn't scream. You didn't faint. You stood up, kept your chin high, and told me you'd face a Montana winter on foot, rather than stay where you weren't wanted. That's grit, Clara. That's the kind of iron that doesn't care about calluses." Clara felt a strange warmth blooming in her chest, a stark contrast to the freezing room. "You still don't know me, Silas. I can't cook. I can't farm. I can teach you to bake bread." "I can teach you to ride," Silas said, his hand sliding down the wood until his fingers brushed the hair at her temple. "But I can't teach a woman to have a spine like yours. You've got more heart than any farmhand I could have ordered from a catalog." He looked at the barred door, then back at her. "I'm a hard man and this is a hard place, but if you're leaving, I'm taking you myself when the storm clears. I'll pay your way and see you safe to the station." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But if you can find it in you to stay, if you can give a stubborn rancher a chance to learn how to speak to a lady, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never wanted to walk out that door again." He didn't move the bar. He didn't make the choice for her. He simply waited, his hand resting near hers on the rough-hewn timber. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in white. But inside, for the first time, the silence felt less like a grave and more like a beginning. Clara looked at his hand, scarred, powerful, and steady. Then she looked at the bar, the barrier she had thought was a cage. She slowly took her hand off the wood and placed it over his. "The fire is out," she whispered. "Perhaps we should start a new one." Silas didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders finally broke. He leaned his forehead against hers, the rough wool of his hat scratching her skin. "Yeah," he rasped. "Let's start there."